Hi, I'm Lynn Brodie, the CEO of Optometry Australia, and welcome to our webinar, Optometry 2040. Now, before we get down to the business of the night, we've just got a few housekeeping things. If you strike any difficulties while you're watching the webcast, there is a number on the screen that you can call. Now, we're going to be having some polling questions, and this is where we get your input, and that's going to be absolutely invaluable for forming this entire project, Optometry 2040. So we really encourage your participation. Now, when the information comes through to us, it is de-identified. We'd also really like to encourage you to ask questions, send in your ideas and concepts, and over the course of the night, the panel will certainly try to address them. That's a big part of the project, is getting your input. So feel free to put those comments and questions through to us. And also, although the moderators will know who you are, your name or any of the details won't actually appear on the screen. So why has Optometry Australia decided to do Optometry 2040? Well, you know better than us how much optometry has faced disruption in the last 10 to 15 years. And what we were doing a couple of years ago, we certainly know we can't be doing the same thing a couple of years from now and expecting different results. We need to try and grasp the future. There's been a huge amount of change from technology. We constantly deal with government and political change. And of course, there's demographic change. All kinds of things are making life a little bit more uncertain. And we hear from our members all the time that they just want to take more control of their future. So futures thinking and future studies is a really interesting field and a way that we can really grasp what might happen out there in the next decade or two, and especially by 2040. We're going to be using methodologies, different techniques that are very rigorous, being developed, some of them by one of the people involved in our project, Sahel in Italia, who I'll talk a little bit about a little bit sooner from now. So these are ways we can gather all the information. So it won't just be the information that we get tonight through the webinar, but also in the workshops that we'll be having right around the country. And the whole idea is to get what is the plausible future. There'll be futures that we want, and there'll be futures that we don't want. And what we need to do is be able to look at those and go, well, if we don't want that one to happen, what do we need to do to make sure we get to the ones that we do? This is a really, really exciting project, and we really thank you for participating tonight, and we certainly look forward to meeting you face to face as we move around the country doing the workshops. So tonight what we'll do, we will be hearing from Professor Sahel Taylor. He's an international futurist, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the exciting stuff that he does, but he will get you into the mindset of what futures thinking and studies really are. I'll then be handing over to Sky Capuccio. Sky's part of our team at Optometry Australia, and she'll be talking a little bit more about the methodologies that we'll use over the course of the project, but also some of the research that we've already done and the research that we'll do into the future, just to round off the whole project. Then you'll be in the capable hands of Professor Nikki Ellis. Nikki's a public health guru who's worked internationally and here in Australia and has done some really innovative projects around public health, as well as around futurist and in health. And of course, many of you will know Simon Hanna. So Simon will also be here to take you through, gather all your feedback, answer your questions, and listen to your comments. So we're very, very privileged to have Sahel as part of the Futures team. He's quite an amazing man, and he will be available to do some of our face-to-face workshops, which will be very exciting for those that can get there. Sahel has a very interesting career. He, in 2015, he was awarded the very first UNESCO Chair of Future Studies. He's been renowned by other futurists. In fact, recently won an award where he was named the all-time best futurist. He's a professor at Tam Kang University in Taipei and an associate at Mount Eliza Business School and Melbourne Business School. Now, what he's going to do in our short video is get you to think about futures and change the mindset. And that's what's really important in this process. It's not about how we think every day, but looking at things in a very, very different way. Sahale's worked around the world. He's engaged with governments like Singapore and Malaysia, as well as major corporations and lots of government departments and non-government departments. So here is Sahale to tell you about future studies.
I'm here to talk a bit about futures thinking, and there's some core concepts that are useful as we think about the future. First, to think in terms of horizons. Horizon 1 is we're too busy, we can't do new stuff, we can't innovate. Horizon 3 is the vision where we want to be in 10, 15, 20 years. Horizon 2 is the zone of uncertainty and also action. So for example, one group we were looking at health futures, Horizon 3 was a preventive, personalized, predictive, participatory health system, which basically means that the hospital becomes far less important. We have home health clinics, people are responsible for their own health. So this was a fantastic Horizon 3 vision, but for many people in the room, it was too far. So Horizon 2 was, what are some things we can do today to start to create this preventive participatory vision? So what are some measures for prevention, for example? Horizon 1 is where you don't want to be, where you think the future will be just like today, so you do nothing and then get caught. Now, some of the core concepts of futures is, one is, what's the use future? To transform your organization, your institution, your membership, you have to ask, what's the use future? The use future is a practice you're doing day to day that doesn't work, but you keep on doing it. So for example, for some policing defense organizations, it's hierarchy. Hierarchy worked for a certain period in history, but now it's being adaptable, agile, flexible, it's capability based. So hierarchy then stops working. What works in one era doesn't work in the next. So if we see in education, we have basically, it's the factory model that continues. Factories are everywhere. Schooling still feels like a factory. So we're starting to look at now the changes are flipped classrooms, learning from home, learning from everywhere. To do that, we have to ensure that principals start to move from being in control to a story of we're all learners. So the first idea, along with the 3 horizons, is the use future. What are we doing today that doesn't work? The second idea in futures is, what's the disruption? What's changing? For example, if you're an energy company, we see we're moving from large energy products, large energy projects, to every Australian becomes their own energy producer. Every home has solar. So that changes the entire business model. So what should an energy company be doing? Are they an energy provider? Or in fact, are they just linking communities together, linking homes together in a new energy, a new ecology of energy, in effect, an Uber of energy, an internet of energy. So you start to ask, what's being disrupted? We're moving from agriculture that's meat-based to what's called pure meat, in vitro meat. If that occurs, what happens to the agriculture system? So disruptions are core technologies, demographic shifts, political shifts that change the nature of everything that we're doing, that you're doing. Once you're aware of these disruptions, you can ask, do I ride the wave of change? Do I create my own wave of change? How do I do things differently? For example, in dentistry, if 3D printing of braces takes off, what happens to the dentist? Now, to answer that question, we have the third core concept of futures, which is scenarios. Not one future, but multiple futures. So for example, in the model where you have 3D printed braces, scenario 1 is dentists push back. We don't want 3D printed braces. We want regulation to disallow it. Scenario 2 is in your own dentistry, you have someone actually helping the patient make 3D printed braces. And then over that, you develop intellectual property and you become really good at it. So you're doing the low end and the high end, and the high end, you're doing a different type of training. You may be able to train younger dentists, or you actually train young people to make their own braces. So your purpose changes. So scenario 1 is defend. Scenario 2, in fact, you include the new technology and you create value out of it. Scenario 3 would be the technology moves so quick, you get left behind, you drown in the wave of change. So we don't know the answer to the future. Scenarios help us map out the possibilities. The fourth core idea of futures is the metaphor. The notion is culture eats strategy for breakfast. If I can understand the metaphor of my company, my organization, my country, then I know what's possible, what's not possible. We had one company, they were an energy producer. They wanted to change, but they were unable to. So in board meetings, they just kept on doing business as usual. Once we discovered that their metaphor was Queen Elizabeth, a large ship that couldn't change, then of course we understood why change was difficult. They didn't feel they needed change, they had a monopoly. So their new story was Queen Elizabeth with patrol boats. Patrol boats were 4 or 5 action-loading projects where they go out in the market and they try some. They experiment, they learn by doing, then the ship can change. So once you figure out your metaphor, you know what's possible. If we look at Asian cities, we see congestion. Why is that? The culture is car ownership. The metaphor is I love my car. People want to catch up to the West. If we want a different Asia, we have to change the story, the narrative, the metaphor to I love my community, I love my neighborhood. Then it goes from car as ownership to mobility, to having multiple transport systems. We're no longer looking at number of paved roads, we're looking at how do we finance, how do we fund community, connectivity, in fact, even intimacy. So the metaphor starts to change the story we tell ourselves about today to the story that we can be in the future. If we change our story, we start to look for different things, we start to look for different futures. Thanks so much.
Good evening and welcome back to the live part of our webinar tonight. My name's Sky Capuccio and I'm part of the policy team at Optometry Australia. So Lynn tonight's provided us with an overview of the Optometry 2040 project and why we think it's so important to be undertaking it at this point in time. And we've heard Sahil provide an overview of some of the core concepts in futures thinking. So I want to now give you an overview of the approach that we at Optometry Australia are taking to identify plausible and preferred futures for optometry, and to introduce you to some of the key critical issues that we've identified as potentially shaping optometry's future in the next 20 years. Much of this information is addressed in the discussion paper that was circulated prior to the webinar, and I hope most of you have had the chance to read this, but if not, this shall serve as a bit of an overview, and if you have, it will hopefully provide a useful recap. I did just want to pause before I begin to remind everybody that there is plenty of opportunities to ask questions and engage tonight. So if you would like to ask questions whilst we're speaking, please shoot them through and we will definitely try to get to them. So as Lynn noted, the purpose of Optometry 2040 is to support the profession in taking control of its future by identifying likely scenarios for the future of optometry and by identifying those which the profession consider they want the future to look like, and also those that they're really keen to try and avoid. We think to do this, it's important, as Lynn also mentioned, to take a rigorous, methodologically driven approach, hence why we're working with people like Sahil and with Professor Nikki Ellis, who you'll meet shortly. So what approach are we taking? Well, in brief, the approach that we're using has 5 key steps. The first one is horizon scanning, which is about ensuring we have a comprehensive understanding of the present and the trends influencing the future. So to do this, we've looked at the past, we've looked at the present, and we've also begun to look at what we see as emerging trends. And we've done so for the space of optometry, but also for the broader healthcare space, and also more broadly than that for the social, economic, environmental, technological and political spaces as well, to have a bit of a think around how they may impact on optometry and eye health. The next step, which is really where we're at now, is about identifying critical issues. So scanning, using our horizon scanning to identify what we think are the key issues that are likely to shape the future of optometry and eye care. And this is where we also really need to hear from you, from members on the ground who are in touch with practice, with research, with education, with patients and with colleagues, to test out these ideas, to see if we've got them right, to see what we've missed, and also to see what you think matters most. And really that's what tonight's all about. After that, we move into hosting a series of key informant workshops across the country. So we will be working with members and also engaging stakeholders to really try and dig deeper and explore further into the issues we identify as really critical and think about how they might impact over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Building on that information through subsequent workshops, we'll also be looking to build future scenarios for optometry, and then begin the critical process of working with members like yourselves to think about which ones we prefer and which ones we wish to avoid. Then as we begin to move towards the end of our series of workshops, we'll undertake something called backcasting, which is really about identifying what needs to be done now and what needs to be done into the future to steer us towards preferred scenarios and to steer us away from those we prefer to avoid. So that brings us to the possible future issues themselves. I'm going to briefly overview these. As I said, they're also discussed and mentioned in the discussion paper that was circulated if you'd like to have a bit of a further look at some point. And then I'll hand over to Nikki and Simon to facilitate your input on these. So we have identified 10 broad categories, which I'll talk through in a little bit more detail. So the first of these is the models of general healthcare. So we're already seeing a move towards person-centred participatory care with increasing patient demands for transparency in healthcare and for patients to really be in control and leading their own healthcare journey. Linked with this, we're also seeing technological changes that enable health consumers to have greater insight into their health. And this is things like Fitbits, where we're seeing every second person sporting some sort of technology along those lines, but in also an increase in wireless and implantable technologies, and the technologies will presumably continue to develop over the next few years, which will be able to monitor a really broad range of health states. This may drive a greater focus on individual responsibility for healthcare and on individual level preventative behaviours. And I think it's quite interesting to begin to think about how that may change the way an optometrist works with and relates to their patients. We're also expecting to see an increase in multidisciplinary and cross-service models of care, which could see optometrists integrated as part of primary, secondary and even tertiary healthcare teams in varying ways. So working with different professions, including those that we may at this point not work closely with. There's also the potential of a growing reliance on virtual care models. We already have some telehealth operating in the optometry space, and there's also telehealth options operating in other primary care spaces. But moving beyond this, as technology continues to advance and we have new diagnostic and health monitoring technology, there's the potential that clinicians may be receiving information about their patients' health on a continual basis or in very different ways, which could have quite an impact on the way the patient and the health professional work together. It also, of course, could have an impact on whether or not we really have many bricks and mortar practices. There's also the potential that we may see decreased reliance on specialised health professionals. Diagnostic and health monitoring technologies, as well as therapeutic technologies, which already we're seeing things like lenses that dispense medicines, are likely to bring quite significant change across the healthcare space. And part of this is that it may enable consumers and generic health professionals to do more of what is now the specific domain of specialised health disciplines.
So, Sky, we've got a question already, yes. A comment.
So, Sky, someone's asked, they've recently seen an article where Doug Perkins stated that new graduate salaries are one of the highest among university graduates, which may justify the creation of more university degrees and schools of optometry, and whether this logic is sound.
Yes, okay. So there's a number of issues related to that, and we will get to talk about the optometry workforce in a moment. But certainly in a traditional sense, optometry has been one of those professions that really does pay very healthy graduate salaries, and typically what we then see is salaries petering off and plateauing. When we come to talk about workforce, we'll be noticing, I will be commenting that we're expecting to see, because of an increase in student numbers coming through, that's not matched by demand from patients for optometric care, that we'll be quickly moving towards an oversupply of optometrists, which may have some potentially negative impacts on those salaries, and I think that's something useful to think about. Certainly in the university space, there's been a number of policy changes lately that came out late last year, which may, in the immediate future, change the number of students we're seeing universities take on board and potentially reduce those slightly.
Fantastic. So let's have more of those.
So returning to our issues, the next issue that we wanted to address was some potential changes in the consumer space. So one thing that there's broad expectation of, and we're already seeing patterns of, are reduced trust in experts, in authorities and governments, and including health professionals. Alongside this, we're also seeing on a growth in online knowledge communities, which are for many people becoming the key sources of information and knowledge, and particularly in particular spaces like parenting and healthcare knowledge. These are really becoming quite dominant. At the same time, and quite interestingly, there's there's an emergent acknowledgement that these can act like echo chambers, where you hear the same voices and the same information repeated over and over again. There's also a changing focus, especially from younger consumers, to put the value on social good and socially and environmentally focused businesses and products, and to rank experience above goods. The next issue is healthcare funding, and I think this is a space that is very much likely to be disrupted in the near future. At the moment, of course, optometry is very reliant on fee-for-service, on Medicare funding, using a fee-for-service model, but there's increasing recognition that whilst this was a really effective model for supporting episodic care, as we have an ageing population, many living with chronic diseases, many of which are preventable or manageable, it's not supporting the style of ongoing healthcare that is really required. Alongside this, of course, government investment in healthcare is continuing to grow exponentially, and so governments are very keen to limit that growth. So we're expecting a greater focus on efficiency and outcomes, which could see a move to outcomes-focused funding, which they already have in a number of countries, but also greater emphasis on prevention, on hospital avoidance, and on care in the community. And there's potentially within this space quite a lot of opportunities for optometrists, which are worth thinking about. The other point in the health funding space, which is worth mentioning, is there's a number of indicators that we may see governments increasingly looking to share costs with consumers, so expecting greater patient contributions. And this, of course, may have impacts on patient access, but it also could see some changes in the private health insurance space if there's additional adjustments made there to accommodate. The next issue that we were wanting to mention was regulation. So as technology changes quite quickly and changes the way we view healthcare, the way we view privacy, data, information sharing, regulation is going to have to change quite quickly to catch up. And at this point, there seems to be some indications that what we'll see is reduced regulation, and it's interesting again to think about what the flow-on effects for optometry might be in that space. E-commerce is another space where regulation could have some big impacts on optometry. At the moment, this is a relatively unregulated space, particularly in relation to the prescribing of optical products, but changes here could have significant flow-on effects. The next issue is the optometry workforce. As we've already mentioned, there are some predictions that we're moving towards an oversupply of optometrists. Some other big changes include feminisation of the workforce. Already we sit at around half of the optometry workforce being female, but around 70% of our students are female, so we're expecting to see increased female dominance within the profession. At the same time, we're also seeing a reduction in the average age of the profession as more and more students come through. And this, of course, will put pressure on and I guess bring with it changes to what people are demanding from their employers. Particularly, there's an expectation there'll be greater demand for more flexible working environments. The other point, which isn't on the slides tonight, but which I thought was worth mentioning also, is that we can expect that optometry will maintain a really highly skilled workforce. We know that the university courses at the moment are really educating people to practice at their highest of scope, so we can expect to see that highly skilled workforce continuing into the future. Which brings us to the issue of clinical optometric practice. So a number of the issues we've already discussed are potentially going to lead to a reduced demand for what we term traditional optometric care. So things like refraction and diagnostics. And a lot of this is being driven by developments in technology. Already things like automation of refraction have become quite standard, and we're already seeing increasing use of artificial intelligence, or at least increasing availability of artificial intelligence programs to support diagnostics, including in spaces like diabetic retinopathy. The flip side of this, of course, is that we may also see an increased demand for disease management and therapeutic care. And there's a few different factors that might be driving this. One of them is, of course, that we have an ageing population with high rates of chronic disease, and with that is likely to bring high rates of more complex eye health needs. There's also, as we mentioned previously, a strong possibility of governments putting an increasing focus on funding for efficiency, which could lead to encouraging more health practitioners in the community to really work to the fullness of their scope and to limit tertiary presentations. And the other one is the potential that technological advancements in the clinical space could bring some things that are now firmly within the medical and specialist domain into the optometric scope of practice.
Sky, before you move on, there are a couple of questions from the audience that I think are worth discussing at this point.
Thanks,
so one of the ones was, Hale sort of mentioned that there's going to be this breakdown of hierarchy and a shift towards more team care based environments, and someone from the audience is just interested as to whether or not we would actively be working towards sort of the hospital care system, or working towards encouraging more team-based care paradigm in the work, in the future's work.
I think there's strong indications in the healthcare space already of moves towards multidisciplinary practice and team care arrangements, and in working hard to limit hospitalisations. Yeah. Hospitalisations are obviously much more expensive and also bring with them huge risks of readmission, infection, etc., etc. So it's in everybody's interests for a more efficient system to draw that care back into the community and support that by wrapping the healthcare team that you need around the individual.
So that would mean that there'd be a change in the relationships between optometrists and other healthcare professionals in the team, with GPs, with ophthalmologists, with community-based nursing?
Yes, I would say so, and I would also add. I mean, I guess it would mean closer working with some of those other health professionals. But I would also add that we're talking a lot about the patient becoming more the driver of their healthcare journey, and along with that, there's the potential that we may see that notion of the doctor as God as really being disrupted, and that the person who's taking a key role in directing their healthcare is the patient.
Yeah. The other one that sort of I know is close to your heart, Sky, is about sort of what Optometry Australia are looking at in terms of this Futures project, and sort of the policies that are being planned to close the gap in Indigenous eye health.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space, isn't it? We've seen quite a lot of advancements in recent years in closing the gap in Indigenous eye health, but there's clearly a lot that's still to be done. Yeah. In terms of where this fits into the Futures project, I think it's worth acknowledging that there is a separate body of work that's been very much led by Professor Hugh Taylor, which has mapped out what needs to happen in the short term to close that gap and to continue to provide good services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. We're definitely involved in that work and supporting that as much as we can. But a lot of that is about continuing to meet people and provide care to people in culturally secure environments and where they're at. So making sure optometry services are reaching out to people where they are.
But I think I'd be flagging that as an issue that we haven't got as a critical issue. So thank you, whoever's offered that. I think that needs to go into one of the discussion paper.
The issues to be considered, yeah.
Have you got any more?
Not for the time being, Scott.
No, but thank you very much for all of the questions. I think already they're enriching our discussion and our thinking. So moving on with our overview of key issues, the next one is business and optical retail. There, as many of you probably know, there's expectations that this will continue to be a really competitive market, and that we'll continue to see the optical price wars going on. A lot of this is to do with ongoing market domination from larger corporates, but also continued slow economic growth in the retail sector overall. We're also expecting to see, again in the retail sector overall, move towards bricks and clicks retail, so where consumers are really looking for an in-store experience, which is supplemented and complemented by the practicality of being able to buy online. There's also the potential that we may see a localisation of services as people as the workforce in general is looking for increasingly flexible working arrangements, and people are looking to avoid the horrors of commutes in our larger cities. There's a strong likelihood that we may see more people physically working closer to home, whether that's from home or from local community hubs. And with this may come a demand for services and retail that are in local hubs. So again, this could have some impacts on optometry and the tendencies to centralise in some of the larger malls. Big data is another space that could be bringing quite significant change. Currently in Australia, there's some advanced health informatics practices, and there's certainly strong evidence of the benefits of data-led decision making. But in the large part, we collect a huge amount of data about patients, and we don't do a lot with it. There is the potential that this could be revolutionised, and it's a strong prediction from many sectors that this will be revolutionised, and that we will see governments, private health insurers and service providers increasingly using health informatics to make decisions. Education and clinical professional development is another space that's known to be ripe for disruption. There's likely to be greater emphasis on ensuring lifelong learners amongst health professionals. We already know that that there's some mooted changes in the professional development space that could put a greater emphasis on ensuring that each individual is having their own professional development needs met. In the research space too, there could be some significant disruption. There are predictions that will move towards a more balanced research agenda with a greater emphasis on readily applicable health research. And to complement this, there are expectations that there'll be greater collaboration between academia and industry to begin addressing some of those research gaps and really support research to be translated effectively into practice. So that's a broad overview.
Okay, thanks, Sky. That was really valuable, I think, to sort of bring it all together, particularly with the discussion paper in front of us. The questions are flooding in for both of you, so I think we're going to be here all night unless we sort of get a move on. But I will just pose a couple of questions, and feel free to jump in, Nikki or Sky. One of the questions that relates to workforce and supply of optometrists that you mentioned, Sky. The question sort of begs the question: how can optometrists demand more flexibility when there's an oversupply of optometry? So if the workforce is saturated, where do we stand in being able to demand that flexibility?
I personally think that's a really good question. I think it's one of those issues where we see potential trends in the future coming to butt up against each other, and where this work mapping out scenarios is really important. We may, for example, want to guide towards a scenario where that flexibility can be embraced by a good match of supply and demand in the optometry workforce, and guard against other possibilities. Do you have something to add, Nikki?
I think that you can see, I think, Sky, the paper that you and the team have done is terrific. And you can see what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at the past, look at descriptions of visions of the future, and look at the trends that are occurring now that are pushing us towards other futures. And we're trying to say, this is what we imagine the plausible futures might be. It's not what does Optometry Australia think the policy should be in the future. We're actually trying to imagine what the plausible futures are going to be, create those scenarios, and then do the backcasting to say, whoa, there's some bad ones there that we don't want and some good ones that we want to move towards, and what do we have to do with regard to policy, research and education to get to the ones we want. Sure. Just to remind you, I think in Sky's description of the factors, you can see there are good things and there are bad things in almost every one. So when we come to workforce, you've got possibly moving towards an oversupply, but on the other hand, we know with a relatively youthful workforce and a feminised workforce that people are absolutely demanding flexibility. So the two are going to mitigate each other, and where do we think that's going to end up, and what do we want to do about it? So it's a great example. Whoever asked that, thank you.
Nikki, just drawing on your physician's experience as well as your futurist experience, a couple of questions have come in around members and optometrists working in different socioeconomic areas and being able to charge beyond or beyond the bulk bill fee, or being able to charge the patients for their services, and the fear that they're going to lose patients if they don't charge, if they do attempt to charge and to try and become sustainable. Can you sort of give us some insight into that, both from your physician's experience as well as?
Well, I think that I'd be giving the insight into my experience as a health reform services researcher. So Sky has already identified that alternative funding models have been on the agenda for the future in health for a long time now. and it's been very, very slow to disrupt the episodic fee for service model that we have.
Yeah.
But I think it's almost inevitable that will change.
Change is coming.
Yeah. So I think we're going to see that if we do move towards operating in a community setting with other health professionals, it's going to be some kind of capitation where we see maintenance of health rewarded rather than just episodic care. Yeah. But I think that that's another really interesting area where there are some potentially positive things for optometry, but also some threats as well.
We'll let you continue.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much. My name's Professor Nikki Ellis. I've been involved in futures projects for the last 10 years, and I've found them a very useful way for creating research agendas in the organisations that I've worked for, which have really been collaborative research partnerships. Now, this is the opportunity to hear from you. So already you're off to a great start, but we want a lot more comment coming in from you on what do you think of those issues. We particularly want to hear about what are some of the important issues that you think are going to influence the future that we haven't heard from already, and we've had the Indigenous health one, which clearly is very important. So are there any others that you think are important? Are there any other aspects of the issues that have already been raised, and you can see them up in front of you? And we're just going to open that discussion for just a few more minutes, and then we're going to get you to vote on the three that you think are the most important.
So shall we open the polling now?
Let's give people an opportunity to just talk more about these issues. Are there any issues that people think we have left out? And do you have any extra dimensions to the issues that have been raised? What did you think of the presentation we've just heard?
So one of the really interesting ones that's coming off the comments section is around the fact that currently we have very different structures for education in schools of optometry. So we've got a Doctor of Optometry in one state, Masters in another, undergrad, bachelor in another. And whether or not at some point we're going to see some sort of consistency or regulation around this sort of difference between states and difference between students coming out of optometry schools.
That's a fantastic one as well. And I think that based on my reading of futures, I remember reading a New York Times article which listed the industries that they thought were ripe for disruption, and one of them was tertiary education, because we see a system at the moment that perhaps isn't meeting the needs of individuals and industry as well as it could. We're highly likely to go to more flexible-based learning, where we have a closer integration between undergraduate and postgraduate because it's lifelong learning, where you do little bits and it's much more flexible and tailored. In terms of generalist versus specialist, isn't that interesting for optometry? Because if we move into working as a part of a multidisciplinary team, what might that mean? You could see in some scenarios it might mean greater specialism will become more important because machines are doing what many optometrists do now, or it may mean that if you're a part of a multidisciplinary team, you have to become more generalist. I think that's one that could go either way. I think that's a really good one where we're likely to see change.
One of the other ones that I think is really interesting, and it speaks to the healthcare funding and the alternative funding that you're talking about, Sky, is someone suggested whether we can move towards an NDIS-like funding for consultations.
So that's meaning that the patient has control and choice, and that they get a budget and that they choose how to spend it. I did some futures work for the Centre for Military and Veterans Health, and we created 3 scenarios: an old one, a current day one, and then a future conflict that hadn't happened yet. And one of the ideas that we had in that scenario was that everybody got allocated not money, but pretend money. So they got $10,000. They didn't actually get $10,000, but they had control over that budget and they could choose how they spent that. And I do a lot of work in the insurance sector, and I can see already the impact of NDIS. People are realising, hang on, shouldn't we let go a bit? Shouldn't we trust consumers more? Isn't it interesting, though, if we if we let the consumers take more control, and if they are more control in their health, their eye health, and at the same time we've got technology doing quite a lot of what optometrists, is that going to put the squeeze on what optometrists do?
Yeah.
On the other hand, you've got maybe a greater role in disease management, and I hear that myopia, an epidemic of myopia is expected. So again, we see the two sides of the coin.
It's a balance, I guess, where you open some doors but close others based on what the future.
And what we have to do now is and this is where your input today is really important, is to say, have we got the right issues? Which of the issues are most important? And then through these workshops that will be taking place over the rest of the year, we call it deepening the future, and we'll be using methods to actually, once we've worked out which of the issues you think are most important, having conversations to get people to say, well, what will be the impact of this? What will be the impact in 5 years, and then what will happen in another 5 years, and then what will happen in another 5 years? So we've got a long way to go.
And it'll take it sort of a step-by-step approach rather than just jumping to that 15-year
Now,
future.
just before we open for the polling, so get ready for that. Simon, you are new to futures methodologies.
Yes.
So when I first met you just quite recently, it was
all new to me.
And so how are you making sense of it?
Well, look, to be honest, Nikki, I've got to admit, at the beginning, first meeting, it kind of sounded like we were trying to predict the future. We were sort of at this. The impression I got was it was some sort of crystal ball that we were going to sort of, hypothetically put a future that, we wanted to reach towards. But it seems since in the number of meetings that we've had and the work we've done through the Horizon paper and the discussion paper we've put together, it is a proven scientific method. And I think the most important aspect to it is that change is coming. Change is inevitable. It's something that we have to be prepared for. We're better off as a profession, as a sector, as an association being proactive, being ahead of the curve, rather than being reactive and sort of trying to mould ourselves to fit the technology that's come upon us, or the funding model, or the healthcare system that we're dealing with. So I think, and it's interesting, it's opened a lot of doors in my eyes to where futures thinking has worked in other fields as well. Sort of followed Sahel and his work in other areas, and it's been really fascinating to see how it's worked. I'm really interested personally to sort of see how some of these issues come up and what issues are important for the members. I'll hold off on what my important ones are for the time being, and wait and see what the group thinks. So.
Well, actually, it's interesting. Sahel sent me a paper a couple of days ago, and it was a publication of a longitudinal study involving a large number of corporations, and they looked at the corporations that had used futures studies and attempted to do this, and organisations that didn't do that, and compared them, and the ones that do this foresight work were more productive. So that's a very important study that's just come in.
I think it's vital to invest in the future and to be able to go, are we ready for what's coming, rather than just be all surprised at, it hit us and we weren't ready for it. So it makes sense now to me, though.
So, Ty, can we start the polling, please? So we want you to...
So, the first question is if everybody that's watching us can select the 3 most important issues that you feel as a member, as an optometrist, will impact on the optometry sector over the next 20 years. So pick your top 3 that you think will impact on the optometry sector, and we'll filter through the results as they come through. So we're just waiting for it. While that comes up, though, there has been a question that, if you're happy to take one more while we're waiting for that. One of the questions that's come through is around aligning with ophthalmology future and where they will be, and does it matter, and how will that work together with specialists, given that we're talking about hospital-based care and being able to work as part of a multidisciplinary team and those sort of things, whether or not where the specialists fit in that regard. Sky, do you want to?
I was just going to say that I think it's inevitable that those futures will have to align together. The question is about how we try and influence how they work together and in which direction that they head.
It's an interesting question, though, that again, I think I'd like to take it as a comment for us to consider again, which is the scope of what we're doing. So we've described it as optometry, and I suspect we may not want to open it up to the extent that we're dealing with eye health in general, but we may want to think about how we're going to consider that relationship in this. I think it's a good point for
absolutely.
us. So thank you, whoever suggested that.
So the results are in.
The results are in.
If you're ready with your
what are the top
pen
three?
and pad, the top three. The top one is healthcare funding.
Healthcare funding.
Yes.
Right.
Followed by very close second, surprise, surprise, optometry workforce. And the third most important issue that our audience believe they're facing in the coming 15 years is the business and optical retail.
Right.
And they were more or less equal. They're about 20% for each.
Well, what we're going to do now is to have the poll on the three that are the least important, and then we'll come back and discuss the most important and see why you think they're the most important and how you think they're going to play out over the next 20 years. So let's go to the poll for the least important. So Simon.
So we'll just wait for those results to come in. While they do that, we might just take another couple of questions if we can from the audience while they're busy selecting their least three important issues.
So you have more there, do you?
We have more questions that we can answer tonight.
Fantastic. Let's keep them coming. Wow.
So one of the questions, and sort of comes up quite often, even through our phone calls, is can we expect Optometry Australia to effectively educate the general public in our current and future scope of expertise? Given that most still perceive that we just do glasses. And so whether or not there's a role in our futures work to make sure that part of that education is focused and pointed towards the public.
So if our process is working properly, that should emerge as an issue, and I think this is another example of another issue that we can add. And then as we take the issues that are most important and consider how they're likely to play out in the future, that will determine whether we think that is an important part of the future. I think we can say, given the discussion paper, we know that consumer empowerment is important. Yeah. So you'd be crazy, if that wasn't being considered.
Part of the focus, yeah.
But that would come out, I think, in the backcasting. So say you have a future scenario where we know that the consumer role, a la NDIS or whatever, is very important. When you do the backcasting, you'd be saying, well, if they're going to be very important, what do we need to start doing now? And educating the public about your potential, might be something that you'd want to see underway. Yeah. So it's worth saying that the output of this initiative will be a description, scenarios for optometry for 2040, plus what we would need to do.
The plan of action.
With regard to not for Optometry Australia. We're doing one for the whole sector. What's needed in policy, research and professional development. And then, of course, Optometry Australia will use that to develop its own strategic plan. But we're developing something that would be useful for other organisations as well.
So I can safely say that the results are pretty clear on the least important issues.
Oh, I can't guess. Can you?
Yeah. No.
So I'm surprised. I'll put it out there, but I think that the least important issue, according to those watching, is professional education and CPD.
Shame on you.
Followed by big data and research. So they're the top three. So do you want to perhaps expand a little bit on what your understanding of big data is and how that sort of works, either revealing sort of how that will impact the future and what work we want to do? Because big data is it's a commonly used term and it can be perceived, understood, possibly in the right context.
Certainly. So I think what the potential predictions around big data are relate to the fact that at the moment in so many different spheres we collect so much information about patients, but we don't use that effectively in terms of looking at how we design systems and how we drive pathways of care and even how we support the best outcomes most efficiently. And there are expectations that we'll begin to see the government moving towards those sorts of approaches soon. So looking, for example, at how a patient might journey through a hospital system and using the data to look at how many patient bed days and all those sorts of things versus a journey of a person with a similar condition in a community setting, you can look at that in terms of data and use that data to make decisions about how you design the health system. We've seen governments moving a little bit towards this. There's some hospitals who are doing it quite innovatively, and there's also quite a lot of discussion about the potential of private health insurers really redesigning and reworking how they offer insurance based on analysis of all the data that they collect, which at the moment they're possibly not using as effectively as they could.
And we're also likely to see that kind of information being used to develop algorithms which will diagnose and possibly even treat.
Yes.
So,
yeah. And the other comment that's come off the SMS and the iPad is around whether e-health records will actually matter in this data space, the capture of e-health records and the data that's being input both by providers and by patients.
I think that's a very, very good question. It's been obviously a very slow start for e-health records in Australia with a lot promised around them, and certainly if they get up and happening in a really effective way that allows lots of health professionals and patients to collaborate, they have great potential. But I think it's a space that it will really be interesting to see whether or not technological advancements almost outpace or outgrow the record as it's currently designed.
I think the other trend is the consumer empowerment. So consumer empowerment can't occur without that. So I think it's important.
Now, another crowd favourite that seems to come up a fair bit of the time is around sort of health fund control over patient practitioner and whether sort of preferred provider arrangements are something that might lead to sort of a US-style health system where it's being controlled, or the profession or the industry is being controlled by health funds.
I think that has been a real issue, but I think again consumer empowerment will overtake that. I think it'll be the consumers that the relationship. Most future health scenarios say the relationship between the patient and the professional healthcare provider will change significantly, and it won't be a command control dominant relationship. It'll be the healthcare provider supporting the consumer. So I think we're talking about a very different scenario.
Yeah.
Now, we've got 8 minutes left. What I'd like to do is to come back to the top three and see if we've got if people can elaborate on why they think those are the most important. So the top three were the healthcare funding, the workforce issues, and the business and optical retail. We'd be interested in how you see those issues might play out, why you think they're the most important, how you see them panning out, and if we can get some more feedback from you on that, that would be good. And then if we just use the last few minutes for any other questions we haven't addressed.
Yeah, we've got a little bit more time. I think we're scheduled to finish around 8:15, so even if we have a few more questions, we can take them as they come through.
So do we have any more questions at the moment?
We do have quite a few. I just want to know whether any of them are related to the top three
that
we had. So
well, let's just the top three are healthcare funding, optical workforce, and business and optical retail.
Yeah, so some of the questions that are coming are fairly practical questions and questions that will be for...
let's take them.
Yeah, so someone says, surely the pending oversupply of optometrists is a train wreck in waiting for optometrist salaries. What can we do about it? Is there anything that in your experience in the past that sort of you've seen similar sort of scenarios?
I think it's I think it's the point that I made before. We know millennial workforces in all industries want to have more flexible work arrangements.
Yeah.
So will that absorb the oversupply? We don't know.
Yeah, okay.
And also, Simon, I'd also add that in that particular space, we are for the first time in probably about a decade seeing the government really looking, so it's government funding policies that have really driven a lot of the oversupply in health professions. And for the first time in a while, we're really seeing some shifts in priorities around how governments think about that. And it really will just take some minor shifts in funding policy, and we will see quite a significant shift in the overall workforce in 5 or 10 years' time.
I think what we do know is that in health, workforce planning has tended to be poor, and that we've tended to just look at the supply side and not the demand side. And I think the kind of work that we're doing here would be good to be considering the demand side as well, and saying, what do we need?
Yeah. So one of the other ones that sort of is a fairly frequent question is around optometry, as you know, Nick, is fairly unique in that there's a fair bit of sort of cross-subsidisation between clinical care and retail products. There's this constant push to try and supplement some of the clinical care with retail income, and whether or not in the future it's possible that there's going to be a real sort of squeeze on the supply of comprehensive care and potentially seeing that the provision of basic care in a way to be able to sort of cross-subsidise that.
Yeah, it is.
Income.
It is an unusual picture, and I think that when we saw the discussion paper, we saw so many factors at play in both of those areas that I think this is an area where, when we do the workshops and focus on issues, we need to do some more conversations around this. We need to say, if we take into account all of these important factors, what is going to happen with regard to that? I mean, what do you think? You're an optometrist.
Well, look, I think, you know, from what if we're starting to, so from where we're at the moment, the interesting thing is that there are different models of care that are already being provided. There are models of care where there is sort of shorter consultations that have that are providing minimal basic care, correct care, and there are others where there's more time being spent with the patient. And I think a lot of it comes down to also patient education, being able to promote the scope of practice that the optometrist works within, and being able to select that niche and that area that you choose and the type of care that you choose to deliver. So I think that there's currently a space for different models of care. Models are being provided, and it'll be interesting to sort of, when we start doing the scenarios, to see where we land on the most desired one.
So that's quite good on the business and optical retail side of things.
Yeah.
Any more?
There are. Did you want to quickly go through the three least important, or you?
No, I think I mean they're least. We just know that people think they're the least important.
Okay.
So let's just take let's hear what people are saying, because we might pick up some more issues that we haven't covered.
So one of the comments says here, there seems to be opposite issues here that need to be addressed. There's patient-initiated and controlled experiences versus expertise and treatment for chronic disease that patients expect, but not necessarily know. And as I read it, it disappears off my screen.
I think that's a really good question, though, Simon, because there is that tension there between increasing drive for patient-led care